Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria by Winston S. Churchill. Today, 125 years ago, the future Prime Minister reported from the fronts of the Boer War in South Africa. We shall follow his footsteps as he narrates his adventures himself. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 16, Trichardt's Drift and the Affair of Action Homes. Ventersspruit, January 22, 1900.
On Thursday, January 11th, Sir R.M.S. Buller began his operations for forcing the Tugela and relieving Ladysmith. Barton's brigade entrenched itself at Chieveley, guarding the line of railway communication. Hildyard's brigade marched westward 6 miles to Pretorius's farm, where they were joined by the cavalry, the naval guns, 3 batteries field artillery, and Hart's brigade from Freer. The infantry and 2 batteries remained and encamped, making Clary's division, while the mounted forces under Dundonald moved forward to take the bridge across the Little Tugela at Springfield, and, finding this unoccupied, pushed on and seized the heights overlooking Potgater's Drift on the Tugela. On the 12th Warren's Division, comprising the brigades of Littleton and Woodgate, with 3 batteries, marched to Springfield, where they camped. On the 13th, the mounted troops, holding the heights above Potgater's Drift, were strengthened by the arrival of 2 battalions of Littleton's brigade from Springfield. Sir R.M.S. Buller established his headquarters in this camp. On the 14th, the rest of the brigade followed, and the same day the corps troops, consisting of Coke's brigade, 1 howitzer, and 1 field battery, reached Springfield. On the 15th, Coke moved to the position before Potgieter's, and the naval guns were established on the heights commanding the ford. All this while, the Boers contented themselves with fortifying their horseshoe position, which enclosed the debouches from Potgieter's Drift, and only picket firing disturbed the general peace. Such was the situation when I wrote my last letter. It was soon to develop, though in a most leisurely and deliberate manner. The mounted forces, which had arrived at Spearman's Hill, as the position before Potgieter's was called, on the 11th, passed nearly a week of expectation. Daily we watched the enemy fortifying his position and observed the long lines of trenches which grew and spread along the face of the opposite hills. Daily we made reconnoitering expeditions both east and west along the Tugela, expeditions always attended with incident, sometimes with adventure. One day, Colonel Byng crawled with 2 squadrons to the summit of a high hill which overlooked the road from Colenso to Potgieter's, and a long and patient vigil was rewarded by the arrival of 5 Boer ox wagons toiling sluggishly along with supplies, on which we directed a rapid and effective fire till they found some refuge in a cutting. Another day we strengthened ourselves with 2 guns, and, marching nearly to the junction of the Tugelas, gave the Boers camped there an honest hour's shelling, and extricated a patrol of Bethune's mounted infantry from a rather disagreeable position, so that they were able to bring off a wounded trooper. Nightly, the cavalry camp went to sleep in the belief that a general attack would open on the enemy's position at dawn. Day after day, the expected did not happen. Buller had other resources than to butt his head against the tremendous entrenchments which were springing up before him. Everyone discussed every conceivable alternative, and in the meanwhile, it was always battle tomorrow, but never battle today. And so it has continued until this moment, and the great event, the main trial of strength, still impends. But though there has been but little powder burned, the situation has materially altered, and its alteration has been entirely to our advantage. We have crossed the Tugela. The river, which for 2 months has barred the advance of the relieving army, lies behind us now. The enemy entrenched and entrenching in a strong position still confronts us, but the British forces are across the Tugela and have deployed on the northern bank, with hardly any loss. Sir R.M.S. Buller has gained a splendid advantage. The old inequality of ground has been swept away, and the strongest army yet moved under one hand in South Africa stands face to face with the Boers on the ordinary terms of attack and defense. Let me describe the steps by which this result has been obtained. On the afternoon of the 16th, as we were sitting down to luncheon, we noticed a change in the appearance of the infantry camps on the reverse slopes of Spearman's Hill. There was a busy bustling of men. The tents began to look baggy, then they all subsided together. The white disappeared, and the camping grounds became simply brown patches of moving soldiery. Littleton's brigade had received orders to march at once. Whither? It was another hour before this part of the secret transpired. They were to cross the river and seize the near kopjes beyond Potgieter's Drift. Orders for cavalry and guns to move arrived in quick succession. The entire cavalry force, excepting only Bethune's mounted infantry, to march at 5:30 p.m., with 5 days' rations, 150 rounds per man, and what they stood up in, tents, blankets, waterproof sheets, picketing gear, all to be left behind. Our camp was to remain standing. The infantry had struck theirs. I puzzled over this for some time, in fact until an officer pointed out that our camp was in full view of the Boer outposts on Spion Kop, while the infantry camps were hidden by a turn of the hill. Evidently a complex and deeply laid scheme was in progress. In the interval, while the South African light horse were preparing for the march, I rode up to Gun Hill to watch the operation of seizing the near kopjes, which stood on the tongue of land across the river, and as nearly as possible in the center of the horseshoe position of the enemy. The sailors were hauling their 2 great guns to the crest of the hill, ready to come into action to support the infantry attack. Far below, the 4 battalions crept through the scrub at the foot of the hills towards the ferry. As they arrived at the edge of the open ground, the long, winding columns dissolved into sprays of skirmishers, line behind line of tiny dashes. Visible only as shadows on the smooth face of the veldt, strange formations, the result of bitter practical experience. Presently the first line, a very thin line, men 20 paces apart, reached the ferry punt and the approaches to the wagon drift and scrambled down to the brim of the river. A single man began to wade and swim across, carrying a line. 2 or 3 others followed. Then a long chain of men, with arms locked, a sort of human caterpillar, entered the water, struggled slowly across, and formed up under the shelter of the further bank. All the time the Boers, manning their trenches and guns, remained silent. The infantry of the 2 leading battalions were thus filtering uneventfully across when the time for the cavalry column to start arrived. There was a subdued flutter of excitement as we paraded, for though both our destination and object were unknown, it was clearly understood that the hour of action had arrived. Everything was moving. A long cloud of dust rose up in the direction of Springfield. A column of infantry, Koch's brigade, curled out of its camp near Spearman's Hill and wound down towards the ferry at Potgieter's. 8 curiously proportioned guns, naval 12-pounders, with tiny wheels and thin elongated barrels, were passed in a string, each tied to the tail of a wagon drawn by 20 oxen. The howitzer battery hurried to follow. Its short and squat pieces, suggesting a row of venomous toads, made a striking contrast. As the darkness fell, the cavalry column started. On all sides, men were marching through the night. Much important business was toward, which the reader may easily understand by studying the map, but cannot without such attention. Having placed his army within striking distance of the various passages across the Tugela, Sir Redvers Buller's next object was to cross and debouch. To this end, his plan appears to have been, for information is scarcely yet properly codified, something as follows. Littleton's brigade, the corps troops forming Koch's brigade, the 10 naval guns, the battery of howitzers, 1 field battery, and Bethune's mounted infantry to demonstrate in front of the Potgieter position, keeping the Boers holding the horseshoe in expectation of a frontal attack and masking their main position. Sir Charles Warren to march by night from Springfield with the brigades of Hart, Woodgate, and Hildyard, the Royal Dragoons, 6 batteries of artillery, and the pontoon train to a point about 5 miles west of Spearman's Hill and opposite Trichardt's Drift on the Tugela. Here he was to meet the mounted forces from Spearman's Hill, and with these troops he was next day, the 17th, to throw bridges, force the passage of the river, and operate at leisure and discretion against the right flank of the enemy's horseshoe before Potgieter's, resting on Spion Kop, a commanding mountain, ultimately joining hands with the frontal force from Spearman's Hill at a point on the Acton Holmes Ladysmith Road. To sum up briefly, 7 battalions, 22 guns, and 300 horse under Littleton to mask the Potgieter position, 12 battalions, 36 guns, and 1,600 horse to cross 5 miles to the westward and make a turning movement against the enemy's right. The Boer covering army was to be swept back on Ladysmith by a powerful left arm, the pivoting shoulder of which was at Potgieter's, the elbow at Trichardt's drift, and the enveloping hand, the cavalry under Lord Dundonald, stretching out towards Acton Holmes. So much for the plan, now for its execution or modifications. One main feature has characterized the whole undertaking: its amazing deliberation. There was to be absolutely no hurry of any kind whatever. Let the enemy entrench and fortify. If necessary, we were prepared to sap up to his positions. Let him discover where the attack impended. Even then, all his resistance should be overborne. And it seems now that this same deliberation, which was so punctiliously observed when speed appeared an essential to success, baffled the enemy almost as much as it mystified the troops. However, the event is not yet decided. After about 2 hours easy marching, the cavalry reached the point of rendezvous among the hills opposite Trichardt's drift, and here we halted and awaited developments in the blackness. An hour passed. Then there arrived Sir Charles Warren and staff. Move the cavalry out of the way, 15,000 men marching along this road to night. So we moved accordingly and waited again. Presently the army began to come. I remember that it poured with rain, and there was very little to look at in the gloom, but nevertheless, it was not possible to stand unmoved and watch the ceaseless living stream, miles of stern, looking men marching in fours so quickly that they often had to run to keep up, of artillery, ammunition columns, supply columns, baggage, slaughter cattle, 30 great pontoons, white-hooded, red-crossed ambulance wagons, all the accessories of an army hurrying forward under the cover of night, and before them, a guiding star, the red gleam of war. We all made quite sure that the bridges would be built during the night, so that with the dawn, the infantry could begin to cross and make an immediate onfall. But when morning broke, the whole force was revealed, spread about the hills overlooking the drift, and no sound of artillery proclaimed the beginning of an action. Of course, since a lightning blow had been expected, we all wondered what was the cause of the delay. Some said folly, others incapacity, others even actual laziness. But so far as the operations have proceeded, I am not inclined to think that we have lost anything by not hurrying on this occasion. As I write, all is going well, and it would have been a terrible demand to make of infantry that they should attack, after a long night march, such a position as lay and still lies in part before us. In fact, it was utterly impossible to do anything worth doing that day beyond the transportation, so that, though the Boers were preparing redoubts and entrenchments with frantic energy, we might just as well take our time. At about 8 o'clock, a patrol of the Imperial Light Horse, under Captain Bridges, having ascertained that only a few Dutch scouts were moving within range on the further bank, the passage of the river began. 2 battalions of Hildier's brigade, the West Yorkshires, and the Devons moved towards the drift in the usual open formation, occupied the houses, and began to entrench themselves in the fields. 6 batteries came into action from the wooded heights commanding the passage. The pontoons advanced. 2 were launched, and in them the West Yorkshire Regiment began to cross, accumulating gradually in the shelter of the further bank. Then the sappers began to build the bridges. Half a dozen Boers fired a few shots at long range, and 1 unfortunate soldier in the Devons was killed. The batteries opened on the farms, woods, and kopjes beyond the river, shelling them assiduously, though there was not an enemy to be seen, and searching out the ground with great thoroughness. I watched this proceeding of making sicker from the heights. The drift was approached from the ground, where we had bivouacked by a long, steep, descending valley. At 9 o'clock, the whole of Hart's brigade poured down this great gutter and extended near the water. The bridge was growing fast. Span after span of pontoons sprang out at the ends as it lay along the bank. Very soon it would be long enough to tow into position across the flood. Moreover, the infantry of the West Yorks and Devons had mostly been ferried across, and were already occupying the lately well-shelled farms and woods. At 11 o'clock, the the bridge was finished, the transported infantry were spreading up the hills, and Woodgate's brigade moved forward down the valley. It soon became time for the cavalry to cross, but they were not accommodated, as were the infantry, with a convenient bridge. About a quarter of a mile downstream from Trichart's Drift, there is a deep and rather dangerous ford called the Wagon Drift. Across this at noon, the mounted men began to make their way, and what with the uneven bottom and the strong current, there were a good many duckings. The Royal Dragoons, mounted on their great horses, indeed, passed without much difficulty, but the ponies of the light horse and mounted infantry were often swept off their feet, and the ridiculous spectacle of officers and men floundering in the torrent or rising indignantly from the shallows provided a large crowd of spectators, who had crossed by the bridge, with a comedy. Tragedy was not, however, altogether excluded, for a trooper of the 13th Hussars was drowned, and Captain Tremaine, of the same regiment, who made a gallant attempt to rescue him, was taken from the water insensible. During the afternoon, the busy engineers built a second bridge across the river, and by this and the first, the artillery, the ammunition columns, and the rest of the mass of wheeled transport defiled. All that day and through the night, this monotonous business of passing the wagons across continued. The cavalry had bivouacked. All tents and even waterproofs were now left behind, within the infantry picket lines, and we awoke at the break of day expecting to hear the boom of the first gun. Quite right to wait until there was a whole day to make the attack in. Suppose that was the reason we did not hurry yesterday. But no guns fired near Trichart's Drift, and only the frontal force at Potgieter's began its usual bombardment. Sir Charles Warren, moreover, said that his artillery had not finished crossing, one battery still to cross, and that there was no hurry. Deliberation was the order of the day. So again, everyone was puzzled, and not a few were critical, for in modern times everyone thinks, and even a native camp follower has his views on tactics and strategy. A very complete consolation awaited the cavalry. All that Warren did with his infantry on this day, the 18th, was to creep cautiously forward about 2 miles towards the Boer position, which with its left resting on Spion Kop, stretched along the edge and crest of a lofty plateau, from which long, gently sloping spurs and arates ran down to the river. For us, however, there was more diverting employment. The mounted brigade will guard the left flank of the infantry. Such was the order, and is not offense the surest defense? Accordingly, all the irregular cavalry moved in a considerable column westward across the front of the Boer position, endeavoring to find where its flank rested, and prying with inquisitive patrols at every object of interest. The order of march was as follows. First, the Composite Regiment, 1 squadron of Imperial Light Horse, the 60th Rifles, Mounted Infantry, and 1 squadron of Natal Carabineers, 350 of the very best. Next, 4 squadrons of the South African Light Horse, good shooting, high-class colonial volunteers with officers of experience, then Thornycroft's Mounted Infantry. Lived in Natal all our lives, know every inch of it, sir. And behind these alert mounted riflemen moved the ponderous and terrible regulars, 13th Hussars and Royals, with the dreaded arme blanche. Wait till we get among them. Altogether, a formidable brigade. There were many halts, and no one hurried, so that at 2 o'clock the whole cavalry formed a line of observation along the lower kopjes by the river about 5 miles long. The Composite Regiment was not, however, to be seen. Major Graham, who commanded it, had been observed trotting swiftly off to the westward. 200 Boers had also been reported moving in that direction. Presently came the sound of distant musketry, not so very distant either. Everyone pricked up his ears. 2 miles away to the left was a green hill broken by rocky kopjes. Looking through my glasses, I could see 10 or 12 riderless horses grazing. A mile further on, a group of Boers sheltering behind a kopje from the continual fire was visible. Suddenly, one galloped away madly, and even at the distance it was possible to see the cloud of dust from pursuing bullets. A straggling column of Boers was trekking away across the plain, back to their main position. Then came reports and rumors. Ambuscaded the Dutchmen, shot 'em to bits, some of them cut off, come and bag the lot. Behind the rumors Barnes, adjutant of the Imperial Light Horse, joyful, with a breathless horse, He explained how they had seen 200 Boers moving towards distant hills to make sure of their line of retreat by the Acton-Holmes Road into the Free State. Galloped to cut them off, reached the hills first, with just 5 minutes to spare, dismounted, commanding the road, and waited. The Boers admitted afterwards that they thought that the squadrons visible on the other hills 2 miles back were the head of our column, and they also blamed their scouts, particularly one, an Austrian. It all comes of trusting these cursed foreigners. If we had only had a Veld Boer out, we should never have been caught. Caught, however, they undoubtedly were. The Carabineers and the Imperial Light Horse held their fire until the scouts walked into their midst, and then let drive at the main body, 300 yards range, mounted men, smooth open grass plain. There was a sudden furious, snapping fusillade. The Boer column stopped paralyzed. Then they broke and rushed for cover. The greater number galloped fast from the field. Some remained on the ground, dead or wounded. Others took refuge among the rocks of the kopjes and apparently proposed to hold out until dark, and hence the arrival of Lieutenant Barnes, demanding reinforcements, 60th Rifles, mounted infantry, and anything else, so as to attack these fellows in flank and bag the lot. Meanwhile, Lord Dundonald had arrived on our hill. Certainly, every man we can spare. Off gallops the mounted infantry and 1 squadron of the South African Light Horse, and later on some of Thornycroft's, and later still the brigadier himself. I arrived in time to see the end. The Boers, how many we could not tell, were tenaciously holding the black rocks of a kopje and were quite invisible. The British riflemen curved round them in a half-moon, firing continually at the rocks. The squadron of South African Light Horse had worked almost behind the enemy, and every Dutchman who dared make a dash for liberty ran a terrible gauntlet. Still, the surrender did not come. The white flag flickered for a moment above the rocks, but neither side stopped firing. Evidently a difference of opinion among the enemy. What do we care for that? Night is coming on. Let us rush them with the bayonet and settle the matter. This from the rifles. Nobody else had bayonets. So a section pushes forward against the rocks, crawling along the ground. Anxious to see the surrender, I followed on my pony, but on the instant there broke out a savage fire from the kopje, and with difficulty I found shelter in a donga. Here were 2 of the Natal Carabineers, one a bearded man of the well-to-do farmer class, the other a young fair-haired gentleman, both privates, both as cool as ice. "View the astonishing outburst of fire," said the younger man in a delicate voice. "I would recommend your remaining here with your horse for the present." Accordingly, we lay still on the grass slope and awaited developments. The young gentleman put his helmet over the crest on the end of his rifle and was much diverted to hear the bullets whistle round it. At intervals, he substituted his head for the helmet and reported the state of the game. "By Jove, the rifles are in a hot place." I peered cautiously. 100 yards away, the mounted infantry section were extended. The dust spurts rose around the men, who remained pinned to the earth, scarcely able to raise their heads to fire. Whatever passed over them came whizzing in our direction. The Natal volunteer, however, was too much interested in the proceedings to forego his view. There, they've fixed bayonets. Why, they're coming back. They've had someone hurt." I looked again for a moment. The line of riflemen was certainly retiring, wriggling backwards slowly on their bellies. 2 brown forms lay still and hunched in the abandoned position. Then suddenly the retiring riflemen sprang up and ran for shelter in our donga. One lad jumped right in among us, laughing and panting, and the whole party turned at once and lined the bank. First-class infantry can afford to retire at the double, sure that they will stop at a word. "We got to within 50 yards of the Dutchmen," they said, "but it was too hot to go further. They've shot 2 fellows through the head." Eventually, we all retired to the main position on the ridge above us. Lord Dundonald and his staff had just arrived. There's the white flag again. "Shoot the devils," cried a soldier, and the musketry crashed out fiercely. "What's to be done, sir?" said the captain, turning to the brigadier. "The white flag has been up off and on for the last half hour, but they don't stop firing, and they've just killed 2 of my men. Give them one more chance. Cease fire there, will you?" For the men were very angry, and so at last the musketry died away, and there was silence. Then, from among the rocks, 3 dark figures stood up, holding up their hands, and at this tangible evidence of surrender, we got on our horses and galloped towards them, waving pocket handkerchiefs and signaling flags to show them that their surrender was accepted. Altogether, there were 24 prisoners, all Boers of the most formidable type, a splendid haul, and I thought with delight of my poor friends, the prisoners at Pretoria. This might redeem a few. Then we searched the ground, finding 10 dead or dying and 20 loose horses, 10 dead and 8 badly wounded men. The soldiers crowded round these last, covering them up with blankets or mackintoshes, propping their heads with saddles for pillows, and giving them water and biscuits from their bottles and haversacks. Anger had turned to pity in an instant. The desire to kill was gone. The desire to comfort replaced it. A little alert officer, Hubert Goff, now a captain, soon to command a regiment, came up to me. 2 minutes before his eyes were bright and joyous with the excitement of the manhunt. He had galloped a mile, mostly under fire, to bring the reinforcements to surround the Boers. "Bag the lot, you know." Now he was very sad. "There's a poor boy dying up there. Only a boy, and so cold, who's got a blanket." So the soldiers succored the Boer wounded, and we told the prisoners that they would be shown courtesy and kindness worthy of brave men and a famous quarrel. The Boer dead were collected, and a flag of truce was sent to the enemy's lines to invite a burying and identification party at dawn. I have often seen dead men killed in war, thousands at Omdurman, scores elsewhere, black and white, but the Boer dead aroused the most painful emotions. Here by the rock under which he had fought lay the field cornet of Heilbronn, Mr. de Mentz, a gray-haired man of over 60 years, with firm aquiline features and a short beard. The stony face was grimly calm, but it bore the stamp of unalterable resolve, the look of a man who had thought it all out and was quite certain that his cause was just and such as a sober citizen might give his life for. Nor was I surprised when the Boer prisoners told me that Mentz had refused all suggestions of surrender, and that when his left leg was smashed by a bullet, he had continued to load and fire until he bled to death, and they found him, pale and bloodless, holding his wife's letter in his hand. Beside him was a boy of about 17, shot through the heart. Further on lay our own 2 poor riflemen with their heads smashed like eggshells, and I suppose they had mothers or wives far away at the end of the deep-sea cables. Ah, horrible war, amazing medley of the glorious and the squalid, the pitiful and the sublime. If modern men of light and leading saw your face closer, simple folk would see it hardly ever. It could not be denied that the cavalry had scored a brilliant success. We had captured 24, killed 10, and wounded 8 total, 42. Moreover, we had seen the retreating Boers dragging and supporting their injured friends from the field, and might fairly claim 15 knocked out of time, besides those in our hands, total 57, a fine bag, for which we had had to pay scarcely anything. 2 soldiers of the mounted infantry killed, 1 trooper of the Imperial Light Horse slightly, and 1 officer, Captain Shore, the 23rd officer of this regiment, hit during the last 3 months, severely wounded.
This concludes today's reading of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, by Winston S. Churchill. Join us also on January 25th for the subsequent chapter. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thanks for listening, and so long.